Welcome everyone to American University's School of International Service for our event today on the U.S. domestic response to 9/11. This is the last in our series of events about the events of 9/11 and the events that followed 9/11, and we're really glad to have you here today. 20 years ago, we were scrambling. We were scrambling to make sense of things. We were traumatized by the attack itself, but we also faced a serious dilemma about what to do next. And at the time, our discussions were animated by two big fears. The first fear was another attack. There was genuine concern that al-Qaeda was not done and that the 9/11 attacks, however horrible, might just be foreshadowing of other attacks to follow. The second fear was that we might go too far to prevent such an attack from taking place. That is, that if we pushed too hard in the name of domestic security, we might inadvertently trample on bedrock principles of civil liberties. Such concerns intensified after Congress passed the USA Patriot Act in October 2001. The Department of Justice claimed that the act was important and necessary, and that it simply reflected an evolution of existing laws to match a new security environment. But critics were less certain of that. They worried that the way that the law was written could lead to a slippery slope and the progressive erosion of civil liberties and individual protections. In the meantime, several institutions were born in the wake of 9/11, including the Department of Homeland Security, the Transportation Security Agency, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. As these new institutions figured out their roles, staffing positions, setting new organizational priorities, they had to navigate these really thorny issues of trying to fulfill their security mission without eroding civil liberties. Today, with the benefit of 20 years, we can look back and see how well they did. We can look back on the experience of the last 2 decades with the advantage of hindsight and try to do a kind of evaluation on an issue which was important in understanding recent history, but also I would say important moving forward as well. And I'm really pleased to say that we have an outstanding group of scholars and practitioners who can speak to these issues directly. Alex Joel is a scholar in residence and professor at the Washington College of Law here at AU. Previously, he was senior officer in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where until June of 2019, he served as the chief of the Office of Civil Liberties, Privacy, and Transparency. Previously, he worked in the private sector and as an attorney at the CIA's Office of the General Counsel. Ashley Gorski is a senior staff attorney with the National Security Project of the American Civil Liberties Union, where she litigates and works on policy issues related to government surveillance, national security, prosecutions, and racial and religious discrimination. Finally, Sikina Hasham is a senior policy advisor at US Customs and Border Protection, where she currently supports international negotiations to expand pre-clearance and the implementation of emerging technologies. Prior to her current position, she worked at the Department of Homeland Security, and she's also supported advocacy efforts at Amnesty International's USA Counterterrorism and Human Rights Division. The discussion on our panel will last about 40 to 45 minutes, and we will have time available at the end for question and answer. If you'd like to ask a question, please do. Use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. I will be monitoring that window as our conversation goes on. And hopefully I'll have time to get to everybody's at the end of the hour. Closed captioning is available to those who need it. Please click on the option at the bottom of your screens. Finally, we do ask that no one record this session. We will be recording the webinar, and it will be available later on the SIS YouTube channel, so no need to record it yourself. With that, let's get on to our discussion. And Alex, I'd like to start with you. As I said in the introduction, you were working in the private sector before 9/11, and then you re-entered government service, where you soon found yourself kind of on the front lines of this debate that I opened with. Can you talk about your experience at the start and what led you to come back to government service and how you entered into that job?
Yes, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be a part of this great panel and to talk about our experiences following 9/11 and what we're seeing today. So when 9/11 happened, it was a huge shock, of course, as we all remember. I was working at that time at Marriott International. I was the privacy, e-commerce, and technology attorney there. And new business ventures. I literally thought I had the best job possible for an attorney. I was in-house at a great company. I really enjoyed my work. I was doing cool stuff, that we always hope to do after you graduate from law school. And then 9/11 happened, and it sort of, shook me like it shook a lot of people. And I started immediately exploring how I could get back into public service. I had been in the Army at the JAG Corps for 4 years before. And a friend of mine actually pointed me towards CIA. He said, "You really ought to look at the CIA's Office of General Counsel." I had no idea that would be a path for me. I had completely out of the blue. So I sent them my resume. They interviewed me very quickly, and within a year, after gone through all the security clearance and giving notice, I was at CIA as the Office of General Counsel, working on providing advice for intelligence activities. And like, as you said, I wasn't literally on the front line, but I was dealing with some interesting issues there. I can't go into those issues because I haven't been cleared for that. But it was certainly, I wasn't in Kansas anymore, as people like to tell me. And then when the Office of the Director of National Intelligence was created, so after 9/11, there was the 9/11 Commission, as we all remember. The 9/11 Commission had a series of recommendations. One of their findings was that the intelligence agencies had failed to connect the dots. This was a very common metaphor at the time. Had failed to connect the dots, had collected the wrong dots, had not connected them, et cetera. So they felt that the job of leading all of the intelligence agencies was too much for the head of CIA to do, who that was the person who was doing the job at the time. They were leading not only a huge agency, the CIA, with a very important national security mission, but the head of the CIA was also leading all of the intelligence agencies as well, as coordinating them. And so they took that coordination job, that leadership job for the community, and put it into a new office called the Director of National Intelligence. And the same statute that created the Office of the Director of National Intelligence created a Civil Liberties Protection Officer position and had that person report directly to the Director of National Intelligence. And the first DNI was John Negroponte, who had recently served as ambassador in Iraq. And he was sworn in April of 2005. And I was at CIA at the time. I volunteered to be detailed over to the ODNI to help stand up the ODNI. And I was detailed over in June of 2005. And I became the Civil Liberties Protection Officer, first on an interim basis and then on a full-time basis. And I served in that role for 14 years, reporting to 5 different directors of national intelligence. And it was a very interesting and also challenging job.
Great, thanks, Alex. A challenge is putting it mildly, I would imagine. Did you have a background in issues of civil liberties and this kind of law when you began, or was it a lot of sort of learning by doing and on-the-job training?
So I had a background in privacy. The other issues relating to civil liberties, particularly as they related to the government and its activities, were ones that I did not have direct experience with. So I did learn those, but I studied them very intensely. And national security law, when you learn about the legal framework and how it operates, one of the things you quickly find out is that the American legal system, in terms of its national security jurisprudence, a lot of it is related to fundamental rights, as one might imagine, and deals with the fundamental problem of secrecy. So we have a government that needs to do things in a way that is secret, so the normal functions of the checks and balances in a democracy have to change in terms of how they accommodate the government's need for secrecy. So that's something that you internalize very quickly, and as you learn national security law and learn, go through the cases and how the statutes are set up and how the procedures are set up and the scandals that have happened. For example, the Church Committee era in the 1970s, where a series of hearings where it was discovered that American intelligence agencies were spying on Americans inside the United States, doing things beyond what was deemed acceptable, and new processes and executive orders and statutes were put in place in that era to prevent those kinds of things from happening again. So basic national security law, a lot of it is around privacy and civil liberties and managing these checks and balances, and also dealing with secrecy, either helping the government protect secrets or dealing with the fact that there is secrecy and how that impacts how people exercise their rights. So that's that's kind of a professorial answer, but that's a long answer.
No, professorial answers appeal to me, so that's just fine. But I do have a question though, because when you were starting in the early years, there was a great deal of public controversy about these issues. The Bush administration surveillance program essentially was breaking in the New York Times, probably roughly when you were just getting your feet wet in that office. So describe the mood at the time. Were you wrestling with these internally? Do you think that your office had a good handle on it? Or just give us some context for what was going on.
So I come to the ODNI from CIA. CIA had a lot of lawyers, has a lot of lawyers. One of the things that came out of the Church Committee era in the 1970s was a recognition that the intelligence community was under-lawyered, if that's possible. And so a lot of lawyers were hired after that. And so the lawyers were working these issues already. When I came to ODNI, my position was not a lawyer. Even though I am a lawyer, I was a separate independent office. And my job was to make sure that people were prioritizing the protection of privacy and civil liberties as they carried out these activities. So I was partnering with the lawyers, in part because it was just me at first. I was an office of one person. And I was also partnering with the inspectors general. I was looking for institutions that I could leverage to help carry out this mission. And one of the things that I very much emphasized was we all take an oath to support and defend the Constitution. It is every member of the intelligence community's sworn duty to protect and uphold the Constitution. So it's not just the Civil Liberties Protection Officer. Everybody ought to be a Civil Liberties Protection Officer. So we can't do this job properly if you're violating people's rights. And so that was sort of my message and how I was carrying out my job and trying to enlist as many partners as I could in what we were doing. It's true, literally what happened was in December of 2005 is when the story broke on the president's terrorist surveillance program, which was a highly compartmented program. I was not read into the compartment when the story broke. I had no idea. The first I heard of it was waking up and I heard NPR, them telling the story. And that was the day that I was interviewing Tim Edgar, who was the legislative counsel for the Washington office of the ACLU. I see Ashley smiling. So that was the day I was meeting him to interview him to join my office as my deputy for civil liberties. And so we were like sharing, like he was asking me, did I know about this? Like, I don't know what the hell's going on. So I had to make some calls, and he wrote about it in his book, and I had to make some calls and figure out what the heck was going on. And it took me months to get it into that program. So that was an early and very frustrating time to be in my job, where it was being very tightly controlled by the vice president's office, if people remember the history of that. And we couldn't get the vice president's office to agree to expand the circle very much until finally months later, I got read in along with the new Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board.
That's just fascinating. One more point on this, because I could imagine you use the word frustrated, and I would be frustrated too if there's these highly compartmented programs that you don't know anything about. How can you do your job? Do you feel as if that situation has changed over the years? That is, that as your office grew from an office of one to what I presume is a little bit bigger now, is there still frustration that the people who need to be working these issues don't have access or not read in on
that
programs
was my
they need to be read in
only,
on.
that was the only, there are other frustrations, but that was the only frustration of that type. And the reason, and it was hugely frustrating, you know, it was a resignation moment. But the reason I didn't was because my boss supported me. So I knew that Director Negroponte, and at the time, it was Michael Hayden was the principal deputy at Office of Director of National Intelligence. So they supported me getting read in. It was being controlled by the vice president's office, and they were not able to get the vice president to allow other people to be read in. So that was for me, as long as the DNI supports me getting access to the information, I felt like that was what I needed to hear to feel like I could continue to be effective within my role, which is within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. But yeah, there are other challenges and frustrations, but there are also rewarding moments. Like I said, the most rewarding sensation I had from the job was feeling like it was a shared responsibility. I didn't feel like I had to fight to persuade people that protecting privacy and civil liberties was an important priority. We might disagree, as we have disagreed with our friends on the outside. I am now on the outside, but at the time I was thinking of people like Ashley on the outside, disagreeing with them on how to do it, on whether what we were doing was correct under the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. But I always knew that we shared the goal of figuring out how to do it.
Well, I'd like to bring Ashley in on this point. If you can share with us your view on what you think was going on at the time and whether or not the Bush administration was overreacting, and with the benefit of hindsight, how would you characterize the events that Alex was having to deal with?
It was a period of extraordinary government overreach, and we're still living with the effects of it to this day. Right after 9/11, as you mentioned at the outset, Congress rushed to pass the Patriot Act. There are many parts of the Patriot Act that are still on the books, and that gave the government expanded authority to conduct surveillance in the name of national security. And I think many people are familiar with the Patriot Act, have heard of the Patriot Act, but what really bears emphasis is that it's one sliver of this much broader surveillance picture. And the Bush administration engaged in systematic warrantless surveillance that went far beyond the boundaries of the Patriot Act. It violated the Constitution, it violated other statutory law. They were collecting in bulk in the period immediately following 9/11, Americans' call records about who's calling whom, the duration, at what time. And even though this is metadata, and sometimes people think metadata is not as sensitive, this can actually be incredibly revealing information. It's very private. It shows whether you're calling your mother, your pastor, a suicide hotline, an Alcoholics Anonymous, a friend from Alcoholics Anonymous. It can just be incredibly revealing and sensitive information. The government was also collecting in bulk metadata associated with Americans' emails. And then it was collecting without a warrant the content of many Americans' international communications. And it was doing this with no judicial supervision whatsoever, even though you were discussing the Church Committee and the reforms that came after the Church Committee in 1978. Congress passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which provided this clear statutory framework for the executive branch to follow when it wants to conduct surveillance for foreign intelligence purposes. And it loosened the standards that apply in the ordinary criminal context, recognizing that the purposes and nature of foreign intelligence surveillance is a little bit distinct. But under that framework, when the government wants to conduct foreign intelligence surveillance on US soil, historically it had to go to the secret court, a foreign intelligence surveillance court, and show that the target of the surveillance was a foreign power or an agent of a foreign power. So it wasn't exactly this showing that you would make to get a warrant, but it was a very similar process. You had to get individualized judicial sign-off every time you're targeting someone for surveillance. And the Bush administration's approach under the terrorist surveillance program, also known as Stellar Wind, just blew all of this out of the water. And then very slowly, in part in response to the reporting that you were discussing as well from the New York Times and USA Today, once some of this came to light in 2005, there was an effort to put the call records program on a sounder legal footing and to have the Foreign Intelligence Court bless it in one form or another. So they tried to shoehorn these mass surveillance programs into statutes that were not written for the purpose of authorizing mass surveillance. And we're left with the legacy of that for many years because these programs continued. They went through the Obama administration, they expanded. And another example involves the warrantless surveillance of communications content as well. So the FISC for a short period of time blessed what the Bush administration was doing, but finally one judge put his foot down and said, what you're trying to do is completely incompatible with the laws that exist. And at that point, the Bush administration went to Congress. And so in 2008, Congress gave in to the executive branch's demands for greater powers and passed a law called Section 702 that authorizes the warrantless surveillance of Americans' international communications on a massive scale. And that law is still on the books as well. So I think it's easy to say with the benefit of hindsight that the Bush administration went too far, but even at the time, there were people who were very concerned about the Patriot Act, very vocal about that. The public didn't know what the Bush administration was doing because it was so secret, because even people at the highest levels of government didn't know what was happening, as Alex was saying. It was something that was held very closely. But then once these surveillance programs were subject to greater public scrutiny, in some instances, there was pushback. And so I think, an important lesson here is around transparency and the importance of transparency, and then also public accountability. When, for example, the call records program came to light through the Snowden disclosures, it was challenged through the ordinary public adversarial courts, not the secret FISC. And the Second Circuit Court of Appeals said, this is unlawful. And very shortly thereafter, Congress passed a reform that reined in that program. Didn't go far enough, but put an end to the mass collection of virtually all Americans' call records.
What do you think that suggests about the FISC itself? Now, for people who are watching who are not deeply read into these things, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court comes from a late 1978 law, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, at a time in which electronic surveillance was very different. This is pre-internet, pre-email. We're talking about monitoring phones and telegrams. So at the time that immediately following 9/11, the common argument for changing the law was that FISA was not really well suited for the current communications environment. And the law needed to adapt to allow for new ways of searching for signs of danger in a much bigger pool of information, right? What is your take on that? Do you think that FISA was not capable of adapting, or that there were sort of inherent problems with the court that needed to be amended in any case?
Well, I do think that there are some inherent problems with the court. And one thing that the 2015 reform that Congress passed did do that was useful was institute an amicus, because it's not an adversarial system. And so the amicus procedure brings some of the benefits in the adversarial system, but does not go far enough. And amici aren't appointed in all cases in which we think that they should be. But there were certainly some flaws intrinsic to the FISA court. I appreciate the technological argument that was made for saying that Congress in 2008 needed to allow the mass warrantless surveillance of Americans' international communications, because otherwise it would be too difficult for the government to do the job that it needs to do. But I think that in some ways it assumes that there should be an entitlement to these communications. And because they're technologically novel, it's not as if there's a state of nature or a Fourth Amendment equilibrium in which, oh, well, the government did have access to the equivalent of emails in the past, and so we need to restore that access. That's not where we were. We were grappling with a wholly new technology. And so I think there should have been a different outcome, frankly, with respect to how Congress addressed that new technology. And I think, too, the fact that we're still grappling with the legacies of 9/11 is especially challenging because of technological developments that continue to advance and accelerate. I mean, when you think about facial recognition, when you think about artificial intelligence, these things fuel the surveillance state, and we are still operating under outdated laws and modest restraints that don't go far enough.
You did mention one more thing very briefly, because I want to get to Sikina as well, but you mentioned that there was, at least from your perspective, some good news after the Snowden revelations, and there were some efforts to rein in surveillance activities. Do you see any other sort of positive stories since 9/11? Any ways in which we've done a better job of balancing the security and civil liberties trade-off?
I think the reaction to the Snowden disclosures is one example of a positive story. At various points, certain secret government surveillance has been subjected to independent oversight, like oversight by the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. And I think that has been useful. For example, when the P Club looked at the call records program in 2014 and closely scrutinized its intelligence value, it concluded that that program had little unique value. And it had a similar assessment when it looked at the modified version of the program that ran from 2015 to 2019. In 2019, it investigated again. The NSA had been collecting hundreds of millions of call records per year, and the P Club concluded that about 2 of those records had some unique value. One went nowhere, and one contributed in some form to a foreign intelligence investigation. But that kind of deep dive into the surveillance that's happening is, it's important, it's essential, and we need to have more of it.
Very good, thank you. Sikina, turning to you now, your experience, I think, is somewhat different from our other 2 panelists. Could you just describe for us what it was like for you, both after 9/11 and your sort of pathway into government service?
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for the panel. And I also just want to quickly upfront note that all the comments that I make are my own, even though I work for the government. I am not currently representing them on this panel, so just want to be upfront about that. So, I did not enter the government until 2011. So a little bit later, 10 years had passed since 9/11, and a lot of what Ashley and Alex are talking about had sort of unfolded, at least it's in its nascent stages before I entered the government. I was a very young adult when 9/11 happened. I am an immigrant and my family is Muslim. So sometimes I think that there are still people who are surprised that I would have ended up working at the Department of Homeland Security. Sometimes I think myself, I am surprised as well. But I think that one of the things that was most influential in how I ended up where I did was that as I was, going to college, going to law school, as I watched all of these things unfold, accountability was very hard to find. It was very difficult as someone who had often been put in the position of answering for an entire religion or an entire group of people, like what accountability looked like. And one of the things that drew me to government service, maybe not in a straight line, but one of the things that drew me to government service was that it became very important to me, and it became very clear that there was not always a lot of representation in the room of people who had different experiences and who understood what it was like to potentially be, and I'm not suggesting I was, but to potentially be on the other side of what the government was doing, to be seen as, as someone who warranted further scrutiny. And so who was sitting on the table on the inside saying, like, are you sure that this is the appropriate course of action? And so I sort of came to government service in a way that I wanted to find a way to have a seat at whatever table I could find at the time, and to make sure that while I may not necessarily have control at the end of the day, to make sure that that perspective was heard. And I think that there is always going to be an inherent tension between, how, I think to Alex's point, I hope everyone in government takes the oath that they take seriously to uphold the Constitution. But I think that there's an inherent tension in how different people perceive what that means and then what that looks like programmatically. And so hopefully, if you have more people of more diverse views and more diverse life experiences, you can try to balance those scales a little bit more. It's not always going to be perfect. I will be the first to concede to that. But I think that the more you have of those voices, the more opportunity you have to sort of meet the two dilemmas that were outlined in the beginning, between making sure we have a secure and safe homeland, but also making sure that we are not going too far and infringing on the rights of U.S. citizens, but also the rights of all the people in the world, as we try to uphold a strong democratic principle and norm.
That's terrific. Have your perspectives on some of these issues changed since you joined in, I think, 2011? How did they evolve over time?
Absolutely. A lot of my perspective has changed. So I started in DHS when it was relatively new already. So it was 8 years old or so. DHS was operational in 2003 after the Homeland Security Act of 2002. And then now it's been another decade. So DHS is still a very young organization by comparison to the Department of State or the Department of Defense. It's also very large. It's the third largest cabinet agency in the US government after Veterans Affairs and the Department of Justice. So that makes it very hard to sort of put it in a bucket where you could sort of easily understand or grapple with. Also, the Secretary of Homeland Security oversees things that by many accounts could be seen as disparate. FEMA is under DHS, USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services under DHS, TSA, ICE, CBP, but we also have CISA, which is the cybersecurity agency. So that is a comprehensive and extensive mission. And I think that is something, one of my perspectives that has really evolved over time in terms of things that occurred in an immediate post 9/11 world that had consequences that are very far reaching, right? All of those organizations were brought together under one umbrella. And I'm not sure how much time and thought was given to contemplating what that meant for one cabinet secretary to have purview over all of those things. At the same time, how much congressional oversight also happens there, in that it's so spread out. So there's a lot of oversight by number, but how much oversight is there by an ability to reconcile the resources needed for those mission sets? So I think that my perspective on what it meant to be the government, and then especially working for an agency that like covers such a broad swath of things that people need from government, definitely changed a lot. I would say it was quite naive when I first started thinking that you can go somewhere and lead the charge for change, and in the very near term, like you could 2 years you wash your hands and you've solved a problem. I think that has a perspective that has definitely been amended over this time.
Sure. Well, I mean, as you say, I mean, DHS is in some senses still a young organization, though. I mean, it is old enough to vote and it's old enough to drive. It's not yet old enough to drink, but it can do a lot. I'm wondering, we all have a soda straw view of these issues, but have you seen changes, for instance, in DHS's relationship with Congress over the last decade? This is an important kind of oversight. Earlier, Ashley mentioned judicial oversight, but what about congressional oversight on DHS activities?
Yeah, I think that there have been changes. And I think there's also obviously always an ebb and flow, right? How much of the work that we're doing is kind of in the limelight or in the spotlight often dictates how much Congress is able to dedicate their resources to our oversight. I might be mistaken about this because I haven't checked recently, but at one point, I believe there were 88 committees or subcommittees of oversight over DHS, because when DHS was formed, it brought in organizations from Treasury and from DOJ and Energy. And so even though they kind of amalgamated them into DHS, the committees that had jurisdiction over those subparts didn't let go of that jurisdiction. So they just all came with us. And so I think that that also definitely influences the ebb and flow of how much congressional oversight can happen, because a subcommittee or a committee that's otherwise looking after, or not looking after, but has oversight over the Department of Energy and then has one little subset that is part of DHS, like that can also sway and influence how much attention an issue gets. I think that if you ask some people, they would say that less congressional oversight can be helpful sometimes. But I think that that can also have a very detrimental effect, because congressional oversight also means that Congress knows about your programs, they understand your programs, they can, amend your programs in a way that's beneficial to those programs, or they can advocate amongst their peers about more resources for certain programs. So I think it's a very complex machine that sometimes works how it's intended to, and sometimes doesn't. And especially in the case of DHS being so behemoth, can mean that sometimes attention on issues that is needed doesn't always come to fruition in the timeline that would be preferred, but until they become larger problems or have the spotlight on them for other reasons, then that can draw attention.
Yeah, I mean, the congressional oversight, it is a big, sprawling thing, and it raises a million questions that are relevant to what we're talking about today. And I should just say, speaking of questions, please do put questions in Q&A for all of our participants. We'll be coming up on Q&A pretty quickly. But before we do that, I wanted to turn back to Ashley on the question of congressional oversight. Right? You mentioned judicial oversight and its role earlier. I'm curious to your thoughts about the evolution of congressional oversight over the last 2 decades. As you noted, the USA Patriot Act was, 6 weeks after 9/11? It happened very, very quickly, and it's very brief and quick. But how would you rate Congress's oversight of surveillance issues, of civil liberties in general, in the 20 years since that time?
Well, Congress has enacted some modest reforms, and it does have an oversight role with respect to some surveillance, primarily the surveillance that is taking place on US soil. But an important thing to keep in mind is that US government surveillance activities span the globe, and the NSA's primary authority for conducting foreign intelligence surveillance is an executive order known as Executive Order 12333, and it outlines and organizes how intelligence surveillance should be done. And when the executive branch is conducting surveillance abroad, it operates under this executive order, and it's subject to no congressional oversight whatsoever. I think Senator Feinstein said several years ago, they just have no handle on it at all, because there are so many programs. It's so sprawling. Under Executive Order 12333, we know from whistleblowers and media reports that the government conducts surveillance on just a mind-boggling scale, like the collection of more than 5 billion records per day on the locations of cell phones around the world. It's used 12333 to tap into links between Google and Yahoo data centers abroad, collected hundreds of millions of address books and buddy lists from people globally. And all of these figures are from 6 or more years ago. So clearly the numbers today are even more staggering. And with respect to this surveillance, Congress has stepped in to impose some extremely modest limitations with respect to the retention of US communications that are what's called incidentally swept up in this global surveillance, because we live in an interconnected world. And so if the government's conducting surveillance abroad, it may very well sweep up Americans' communications and data. And even when Americans think they're communicating domestically, that communication can be routed abroad where it's susceptible to surveillance under 12333. So Congress did one small thing. It's legislated in this space. It clearly has the authority to do much more with respect to 12333 surveillance than it is doing. And I think that is an area where there is just enormous room for improvement, because the baseline is essentially zero.
What would you recommend that it do? I mean, if you had the ability to sort of shape legislation that would constrain the intelligence community and its use of 12333, what would you recommend?
I think first and foremost, putting an end to bulk collection that is wholly undifferentiated and ensuring that surveillance is targeted and constrained and involves the use of discriminants. The US government even admits that under 12333 it conducts collection in bulk. So that's not a secret. It's an officially acknowledged fact about US government surveillance under this authority. So I think first and foremost, limiting the scope of the surveillance, creating more judicial oversight of the surveillance, even if that's judicial oversight after the fact, just having a court looking at some of the decisions that are being made and assessing how they comport with the Constitution, particularly because Americans are affected by the surveillance.
And to you, Alex, can you describe your own experiences working with Congress? Was that an important part of your role at ODNI? And just in general, how would you view the relationship between Congress and the IC as you saw it?
So when Ashley said they have the authority to do more than they do, I think that's the key, right? So Congress clearly actually does conduct extensive oversight. They may not conduct the kind of oversight that Ashley is looking for, in particular with respect to, well, let me take a step back because they do. So Congress obviously funds the executive branch. Congress has a very granular look at anything it wants to look in terms of funding, in terms of how the money is being spent, in terms of whether it's being spent in a way that it wants it to be spent. The power of the purse is a huge power that Congress wields, and it wields it very effectively, I think, and very, from an oversight perspective, very intrusively. So they have the ability to actually get the information they want. Just like Sikina was saying, the intelligence agencies are up in front of Congress all the time. There are countless reports that are being done. I'm a huge believer in congressional oversight, as I am in judicial oversight, as I am with the intelligence community itself using inspectors general and the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. There are a number of different ways in which a democracy needs to think about how to conduct oversight. I call it a system of many layers with many players. Ideally, it would be starting from a blank slate. You conduct something, you carry out something very streamlined and simple. We aren't starting from a blank slate, and nor is any country around the world. A lot of my work at the time, certainly after the Snowden disclosures, was on transparency and on trying to get more transparency about our programs and activities, and also dealing with other countries around the world, other governments, other like-minded democracies. And that work has continued since I've left the government, trying to understand how they protect privacy, how they deal with this a shifting balance that has to be maintained between national security and protecting people's privacy and freedoms. Because as Ashley points out, the technology keeps changing and it's hard to keep up with that new technology and figuring out what the right, how to calibrate what you're allowing the agencies to collect, and then the impact that you have to deal that collection has on people's privacy and civil liberties. So there's, I think, a lot of serious work that's being done in that area, and it is, let's just focus on bulk collection as an example, as Ashley did. Yes, the intelligence community does bulk collection overseas, as has been acknowledged. There is a presidential policy directive, PPD 28, that seeks to protect privacy of people overseas, of non-US persons, because we have other rules and laws in place to protect the privacy of Americans. And and other countries do bulk collection as well. So the United States is not operating in a vacuum here. The intelligence services of democracies around the world are trying to figure out the same balance that we're trying to figure out. And my personal view is that the more transparency we can provide, the better it's going to be for everyone. We need a stronger public conversation around these topics. It is challenging because a fully transparent intelligence service is going to be fully ineffective. So intelligence services are going to need the ability to keep secrets and protect those secrets. And that is going to run into also the need to protect privacy and civil liberties in an open and accountable fashion that we expect in a democracy. So that there's always going to be that tension, and how we resolve that tension is the true test of our democracy.
So one of the, interesting things in this conversation is that we've touched on a number of different oversight mechanisms, like formal oversight from the judiciary, from Congress, informal oversight in terms of media scrutiny and things like that. We haven't really talked about one curious kind of oversight through inspectors general. Right? And the IG is supposed to play a particularly important function in managing this balance because the IG is sometimes called a boundary spanning institution. An inspector general lives within the organization and yet does not report to it. So it's supposed to have the benefits of having access, but also being a bit removed from organizational interest. Sakina, in your experience, do you think that the IG has played a useful role, both in trying to manage civil liberties concerns at DHS, but also, as you say, trying to manage the activities of this broad, sprawling organization?
I think so. I think, as with anything else, it's always a work in progress. I have worked on things that require us to do a lot of reporting up to the IG, and I think that those conversations have been fruitful, and I think that it's iterative as well, because, as you said, DHS is such a huge organization that sometimes with a kind of singular IG, you work through, there are, either they have self-identified or others have identified issues with a program, and sometimes there's the part where you're educating the IG about the program, because they might not know all the nuances of it, and then the oversight piece, and then answering their questions. And I think it is, as with all oversight, a very useful process, and it also helps. I think one of the things that I found quite interesting is that it helps when you are someone who either runs or participates in a program to see the questions from the IG's perspective. I think when you're working on something, you can become very insulated in that project. You have project milestones, you're trying to make a program work. And I think that having that type of oversight, especially from within your organization before you get too far down the road, as the IG sort of bridges that space between when you're starting something or when you're implementing something and when it has reached its final stages, it's very helpful to have that perspective and that review. One of the other things too about DHS is we have a CRCL division, so civil rights and civil liberties, and they play a role as well. And then each of the components of DHS, CBP, ICE, et cetera, have a privacy division that oversees and has kind of and is involved in all of the work that we do to make sure that we are abiding by the requirements of the law in terms of protecting privacy, protecting personally identifiable information, and then making sure we're compliant with all of the other laws and regulatory requirements. So I think that there is a very significant role that is played both by the IG and some of the other parts of DHS and other cabinet agencies that were set up in order to undertake that oversight role.
One of our audience members has a question about the Capitol Police, but I think it has broader implications. The question is that in the wake of the events of January 6th, the Capitol Police is suddenly gaining lots of new resources. And the question is, it's not sure if it can manage all of these new resources, given that it's still grappling with what happened on January 6th and searching for lessons learned. I wonder if anybody has any particular perspectives on that question about the Capitol Police in the aftermath of January 6th. But I wonder also if you'd like to talk about the issue of resources. One of the things we haven't touched on today was that after 9/11, there was this huge injection of personnel and money into security institutions, into the intelligence community, into law enforcement as well. And at the time, there were some concerns that the IC couldn't manage all of it that quickly, having this huge flow of people who were really driven to enter into service and do whatever they could. while simultaneously building these new organizations. I wonder if anybody would like to speak to that problem, some the curse of having too many resources all at once. Alex, you look like
so.
I
don't know that you'll ever get a public official to say that they have too many resources. It's quite the contrary. So just a couple of things. One is the January 6th event has some echoes of the reaction to that event reminds me of the reaction to 9/11, like this big event happens. It's a physical threat. People felt threatened. They felt unsafe. And of course, there's going to be after action reviews, figuring out what went wrong. There will be additional funding. There will be reorganizations, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of that is a very familiar pattern, and I don't see anything that's shocking or surprising in terms of the reaction to that. We do have to remember that, of course, Congress is a co-equal branch, and so how they deal with their own security and then interact with the executive branch on those issues is complicated. It's more complicated than just dealing within the executive branch and worrying about different agencies talking to each other who all ultimately respond to the president in any event, right? So it just becomes a more complicated thing. Certainly after 9/11, there was an increase in funding. We have to remember that there had been this peace dividend following, the fall of the Soviet Union, and there had been funding that was moved away from sort of certain intelligence and national security activities. And so after 9/11, it's again natural and expected that Congress, one of the ways that Congress can exercise its power, as I said before, is the power of the purse. But that money didn't come, it wasn't carte blanche. It was money that was allocated for specific purposes, and needed to be used in certain ways, subject to congressional oversight. So it's not like you're not literally throwing money at the problem, but you are making available more funding that then has to be carefully tracked and reported on. And there's a lot of bureaucracy behind that, as I think anyone in government knows. There's a very long process of how do you justify your budget, how do you get funded, how do you make sure that the funding is allocated properly, what happens when there is no funding. We go on furlough, as government employees are very accustomed to. When the budget isn't approved on time, you end up being furloughed and you go home without paid, and you're legally barred from working and incurring any liability, because that would be against Congress's power of appropriation. You shouldn't be doing government work if Congress hasn't funded you to do it. So there's a lot there in terms of the funding and budget issues.
Ashley or Sikina, would you like to get in on this issue?
I think
go ahead, please.
I think the only thing that I would add is we can take a lot of lessons learned and try to adapt from what we've seen before in similar or analogous circumstances. But I think that one of the things that's very hard when you're reacting to any sort of, perceived imminent threat or our actual imminent threat, and that is unintended consequences. And I think that that's just something that's always kind of a very difficult thing to grapple with. One of the questions that sort of also that this sparks for me is like, how do you know what you don't know? And that is something that in at least in the roles that I played in government, we often think a lot about, because if you're trying to anticipate threat, how do you quantify what you don't know? And I think that some of how we deal with, as I said, imminent or perceived threat is, well, sometimes we just don't know. And so we're trying to grapple with that, and that can have unintended consequences. And I know that doesn't give a clean line to the question about how do you not overspend or how do you not give too much authority. But I think that's something that you kind of have to keep in mind, that you're trying to solve something that you might not know the full scope of. And then there are generally, try as hard as you may, there are generally always some unintended consequences. I think you can work to mitigate them, but it's hard to know that. It's hard to know exactly what they will be. That's all I would add to the question.
Is it, and I guess, Ashley, please go ahead.
Oh, no, go.
No, I was just wondering, I mean, is it fair to say, in thinking back to what it was like in fall 2001, where the mood was the budget tap was turned on. The demand signal from the White House is err on the side of action, not inaction. Is it fair to say that that created an environment in which mistakes were inevitable, or crossing the line was inevitable? Even as Sikina said, even if we don't know specifically what the mistake is going to be, doesn't that seem like it made something more likely?
Yeah, I mean, I think always when you're in a crisis mode, exactly as Sikina is warning, and I'm sure Ashley was probably going to jump in and say something similar, that you always have to worry about overstepping. And you can see the terrorist surveillance program that we were talking about at the beginning here. There was certainly this feeling that, as you pointed out, there might be another attack just around the corner, and we need to do everything we can to stop that attack. And for that terrorist surveillance program, they did get legal opinions saying that they could do it without going to the FISA court. Now, in retrospect, people can question the legal analysis behind those opinions. And as Ashley pointed out, it was eventually put under the FISA court and then eventually led to legislative changes. But there is certainly a lot of pressure in that area. And another area coming out of January 6th that I worry about, or that I think about, is pressure, or how are we going to know next time to stop a similar thing from happening? Well, now we're focusing entirely domestically, right? You're focusing inside the United States. And for decades, we have had a sharp dividing line between foreign and domestic in terms of national security authorities. One of the things that 9/11 brought home to everybody was the fact that foreign terrorists could be operating inside the United States. And so we needed to clarify the information sharing possibilities and issues for agencies involved with domestic matters like the FBI and local police, sharing information with agencies involved with foreign matters like NSA and CIA. But we maintained that line, that we don't want the foreign-focused intelligence services focusing on the inside the United States in the same way that the domestically focused agencies focus. They are subject to their own set of rules and authorities and constraints. And as we start seeing these big events happen inside the United States driven by domestic groups, I always have a concern about whether or not that dividing line is going to remain firm and clear and bright. And I think that's a new challenge that we're now facing.
Yeah, thank you. This raises the question about in the aftermath of very traumatic events like a 9/11, or to in a different way after January 6th, there is always the chance of overreaction for very understandable reasons, right? As people are trying to prevent a repeat occurrence or trying to prevent things from getting worse. Do you think that it's possible? I guess we'll just end with this question for everybody. Do you think that it's possible to gather lessons from the post 9/11 experience that we can apply in the event of a certain trauma down the road? And God forbid something terrible should happen. But are there ways that we can safeguard ourselves in moments of high emotion and genuine fear, such that we don't cross lines that we ought not cross?
I'll just jump in quickly and say yes. And I wrote out actually about lessons from 9/11 that we can apply to the pandemic response. Avoid something like a big bang statute that's passed in the immediate aftermath of a big event. Like, that's probably something that you're going to regret later down the road. And try to plan ahead, try to put in place, try to anticipate what you are going to need to do, and put in place what good sharing mechanisms, good clear lines of authority, just in terms of a government effectiveness perspective, clear and strong roles for people like my former office, civil liberties, privacy, and transparency offices, and inspectors general, and transparency. I think transparency is a huge disinfectant, as former Supreme Court justice once said. So sunlight is the best disinfectant. I believe transparency can help a lot.
I think the only thing I would add to that, agree with everything Alex said, is make sure you have that diverse perspective of people on all sides of how you tackle that challenge, right? A strong and diverse government workforce, a strong and diverse civil society, people who can advocate for all sides of those challenges and to help mitigate them. I think that it is not a unilateral way to prevent redoing the making the same mistakes we made in the past. I think it depends on everybody kind of playing their part and being as diverse in thought and background and understanding and interdisciplinary as possible.
And in addition to oversight and transparency and having diverse views at the table on the inside, I would also encourage those on the inside to remember their oath and their commitment to uphold the Constitution substantively. And while it's true that reasonable minds may disagree on the margins about the meaning of those constitutional protections, in the aftermath of a tragic event like 9/11, that is not the time to be pushing the boundaries of what's constitutionally acceptable.
I'm afraid to say we have now pushed the boundaries on our allotted hour for this discussion, and I hate saying this because it's actually really, really good, and we've covered a terrific amount of ground on issues relating to secrecy and accountability and oversight, and mistakes made, and hopefully lessons learned that we can apply in the future. I would strongly encourage folks who have just tuned in or who've been in and out of this conversation to come back later and watch the conversation on the SIS YouTube. I learned a tremendous amount from it, and thank you to our panelists, Ashley Gorski, Alex Joel, and Sikina Hasham, for not only for their work, but for their insights and their willingness to be a part of this today. Also like to thank our attendees out in Zoomtopia for tuning in today and for being a part of this. This is a collective learning experience, not only for students at AU, but for broader members of the community and for us here on the panel. Our next event in SIS will be about the 80th anniversary of the Babi Yar massacre and genocide in the 20th century.